Right, we're on, and off we go. Let's see who turns up. We've over 400 people registered now, so that's very good. Schubert. Hello, Joan. First as ever. Or first as usual. Susanna, hi. People are shooting in now. Yeah, it's great if you can let us know where you're coming from, because we're pleased that we're getting such a great outreach. So it's nice to know where you are, especially if you're not in Pennsylvania, if you're in other parts of the United States, or if you are out farting somewhere, as we like to say, farting, which of course includes other parts of America like Canada and Mexico and Guatemala and Belize. It's all America. Hello, Mary Lou and Barry. I love the way you all chat to one another on our chat line. It's really nice. It's like a little family. Linda, in the eastern wilds of Pittsburgh. Yes. Never thought of the east of Pittsburgh as being particularly wild, although I can get fairly angry occasionally myself. From Lebanon, not America. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, wonderful. If anybody's interested in the background, we are having another Schubert day. And this is his one and only string quintet, which I think is one of the greatest pieces of chamber music ever written. A wonderful, deep melancholy to it. Forgive me for leaning forward, but my eyes are not what they used to be. Marianne, rain-drenched Irwin. Well, it's pretty rain-drenched. Actually, the sun's beginning to come out, but it was a very wet morning here. Hello, Grace. And hello, Judy and Al. John, I'm delighted it's sunny in Toronto, because I usually blame Canada for all the bad weather we get, which is probably unfair of me. But, you know, on the great South Park principle, when in doubt, blame Canada. I don't really mean that. I love Toronto. Thank you, Patty. I hope it is interesting. We do our best. Susanna, that is very sweet of you. I'm sure there are other exciting things to do, though. I think it's the background music that most impresses. Speaking of Canada, one of the sad things this summer now is that there will be no Stratford Festival and no Shaw Festival at Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I was quite looking forward to both. Was at both last year. Another sad loss. And normally around this time, the Spoleto Festival in Charleston, South Carolina would be opening. And I've had many a happy visit there. I've had quite a few of my own productions presented there. And it's a great festival. If you ever get a chance. If you've ever been, you'll know. But it is a wonderful festival. Music and dance and opera and theatre. In one of the great antebellum cities of America. So that's another festival we've lost this year. Thank you, Marge. Yes, Richard, I know they're going to be streaming. A lot of streaming is going to be happening, and I'll have words about that from us after the talk and also over the next couple of weeks. But streaming is the new live theatre. Hello, Kathleen. Nearly time. We'll let another minute for people to gather. In case you're wondering about the cup, it's a pig. This has no reflection on me personally. It just happens to be a pig. Hello, Kel. Hello, Dennis and Carolyn. Hello, Bill and Joan. We're all beginning to gather. James, yes, I think you did give it to me. Yes. The pig cup, not anything else. We have a great gathering today. Do you like the music? I love that. Chamber music can be so enormous. You sort of think you need a big orchestra, but this particular piece, heartbreakingly beautiful. Good afternoon, Alma. And Susan, I'm happy you're here too. I can't say hello to everybody because it keeps flashing up too quickly, but I do say hello to everybody. And thank you for being with us. Aha! Hello from Haarlem in the Netherlands. Thank you, Anne. That's very sweet. Do I have a favorite book on the shelf behind me? Actually, that's a very difficult question to answer. I have so many favorite books. I could say, well, Shakespeare, or I could, there's just far too many books that I utterly love. I was once asked, what's the book that influenced me most when I was young? The answer was Shakespeare. But also, there was a wonderful book, and it changed my thinking as a young man in my mid to late teens, sort of politically and socially. And it was by the South African writer Alan Paton, called Cry the Beloved Country, which was made a movie. I think James Earl Jones was in the movie. It was made into an opera by Kurt Weill, who worked with Bertolt Brecht, called Lost in the Stars. And it is a remarkable story. In fact, and it was also dramatized. It was put on stage as well. I saw it on stage at the Guthrie Theatre. Not the Guthrie, I beg your pardon, in Chicago. And that was where I met my very dear friend who sadly died earlier this year, Johnny Lee Davenport, remarkable actor. Those of you in Pittsburgh who saw Oedipus Rex when we did it, he was the wonderful actor with the amazing voice playing Creon. But yeah, Cry the Beloved Country, I would say, with any book influenced me in a major way and still remains really important memory and part of my reading, it would be Cry the Beloved Country. And if you haven't read it, you should. Alan Paton, or Patton. Anne, you've only the PICT logo. Can't be right. I've reconnected twice. I don't know what to say to you. I think I'd log out completely and go back and start again. I think that might be your best solution. If the reconnect doesn't work, it's the old principle of, have you tried switching it off and on again? So apart from that, I can't help you. The music a tad loud. Can music be too loud? I asked myself. Well, I'm going to be fading it out now because we're actually going to begin. So there, now you can be happy. So welcome everybody to our third installment on what is basically my feelings about Oscar Wilde. And as I say when we start these each time, this is what I think. And everything I tell you may be wrong, but I'm only talking from my own experience and my own perspective about this, to me, phenomenal writer and phenomenal mind. And this week we're going to talk about the end of him. Before we do that, I have some what we would describe as public service announcements to make. So first of all, last week the trivia question was, what was the maiden name of Oscar's mother, known commonly as Lady Wilde? And it was Francesca Jane Elgee. And the winner was Patricia Passeltiner, who will be receiving 2 tickets to our next onstage production, whenever that may be. And more about that will be coming later, and especially next week. And speaking of next week, we're going to do, and by popular demand, which means at least 3 people asked for it, we're going to do 2 programs, two webinars over the next 2 weeks on Oscar Wilde's play Salome. And I'm delighted to do that because I think everybody knows about the 4 major plays. This is, to my mind, one of the great pieces of tone poem playwriting ever attempted by anybody. It's an exquisite piece of writing. It's a remarkable play. I was in it for 20 years on and off, and I also directed it. It was the first play I directed for PICT when I first came here to Pittsburgh. So to me, it's an important piece. Quite a lot of people have said, will you do more about Salome? Will you talk about it? Because of the nature of the piece. So I'm going to do two webinars over the next 2 weeks on Salome. And then we have something special planned for mid-June, which I will tell you about next week. We are now reaching out to at least 9 different countries, as well as many cities across the USA. I think this is wonderful, and I'm so pleased that what we are doing is actually reaching out across the world, and quite literally across the world. We have people in India, we have in Turkey, in the Czech Republic, we have also Western Europe, and obviously the UK and Ireland. But it's wonderful that this is happening, and it's part of what we aspire to be, that we have an outreach beyond our own city here in Pittsburgh. So for all of us, for PICT particularly, spread the word. If wherever you're living, you're tuning in every week to listen to these, and there will be a lot more, we're going to keep this going forever, and there'll be other speakers, it won't just be me, because you're going to get tired of me. We'll have other people doing webinars in this slot. So do let your friends know, because right through the summer, we're going to be discussing classics from literally Shakespeare to Dorothy Parker. So, I mean, how much more eclectic can you get in terms of classic writing? It's all there waiting for you. It's going to be coming up. Spread the word, tell your friends. We also want to know what you would like us to talk about, and we want to give you, this is a service. We want to serve you with information and objective opinion and even subjective opinion about classic text. So you let us know what you would like. Now, if you look at your screen, you'll see a poll button where you can push it and answer the poll question. It's next to questions, polls. And there are 2 questions we'd like you to answer this week. And this is purely about when we do this. One question is the time that we are doing this good for you? Are you happy with the particular time of day we're doing it? Now, it's rather dependent on the fact that we're 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US, which means we're 11 in the morning Pacific time. But we're also 7 in the evening in Western Europe, or possibly 8 in the evening, and even 9 or 10 when you get to Turkey. Where we are in India is probably the middle of the night. So we can't make it happy for everybody, but we'd love to know, generally speaking, is this time okay for you? And if there's a different time, please let us know. Just drop us an email, even if you just say the time on the email. It just gives us a picture of how we can serve you best. And always remember, if you can't get the live broadcast, it's there, available a few hours later, and it stays online. You can watch any of the back programs. The other question we would like is a very simple one. Are you happy? We're currently doing 90-minute webinar. We did do 60 minutes. What length of webinar suits you best? And it's not simply a question of how long can you put up with me or whoever else is talking, but also does it suit your own timetable? So is it 60 minutes, 90 minutes? What would you prefer? You can push the poll button at the end. I'll remind you at the end, and you can always contact us with any questions, any inquiries through our website, which is www.picttheatre.org, and that's theatre spelt in the proper way, R-E, not E-R. And just to remind you, while you're on the website, and at any time when you're emailing us or responding to us or thinking about us, you can always make a donation, because every dollar, every pound, every euro, every rupee, every zloty, everything counts. So if you can make a donation, please do. It doesn't matter how small, just please make a donation to help us keep going. So there will be another trivia question at the end of this particular webinar. And as I said, remember to tell your friends if they've missed this one, they can catch up with it this evening or in about 4 or 5 hours' time when it becomes available online. So now, Oscar Wilde, The Time of Trial and One of Us Has to Go, which is a strange title, but they've all been strange titles. I want to talk today about I suppose the more infamous aspect of Oscar's reputation, because he was a multifaceted person. And there were so many levels at which he dominated the period that he existed. And remember, he didn't make 50. He was 46 when he died. His life was incredibly short and so filled with different Oscars. Oscar the poet, Oscar the playwright, Oscar the aesthete, Oscar the talker, Oscar what one might say, the commentator and philosopher on the late Victorian age. All of these things seem to happen throughout his life, but also to some extent got segmented by his life. The period when he toyed with journalism, the period when he was a poet, the period when he started writing plays badly, the period when he wrote plays with utter genius, the period of his life when his own sexual preferences, which were against the law at that time, started to dominate him, dominate his life, and eventually destroy him. We're talking about the destructive period, the period at the end. Now, more has been written. I mean, there are more books about Oscar Wilde. I mean, what you see behind me, I have the equivalent of in books about Oscar elsewhere in my house. It's more books written about Oscar than possibly one or two other writers. The ones who always end up in the Oxford Dictionary, you know, Wildean, Beckettian, Shakespearean, Shavian, and Pintoresque. People just found it and constantly find it fascinating to write about Oscar, because in that short life, there are so many unanswered questions. The big question is the why. Why did Oscar do what he did when the problem arose? And I'm going to come to that. Oscar, as you all probably know, had developed, I'd spoken before about his relationship with Robbie Ross and the introduction to Lord Alfred Douglas, Bosie, as he was known. That relationship with Lord Alfred, with Bosie, became somewhat stressed by the fact that Bosie's father, the Marquis of Queensbury, a man of completely unpleasant disposition, very attractive man, but just angry, cruel by nature, found out about it and did everything in his power to prevent it, to stop it from happening. He'd been aware for quite a considerable period of time of this relationship, the growing affair between Bosie and Wilde. He tried on many occasions to get Bosie to end the relationship, and Bosie would have none of it. Bosie had to realize that not only was Oscar totally and completely infatuated with him, but that he was also willing to spend upon him untold sums of money. Bosie, who had a very small, relatively small allowance from his family, was never short of a meal, of gifts. Oscar was buying him gifts constantly. Oscar was a great person for the giving of gifts. Remember what we were talking about, Florence Balcom, that first romance in his life, and Oscar buying her the cross with their names entwined on it. I'll come back to Florrie Balcom again as well. Oscar had a wonderful, deep, profound sense of romance. And that romance for Oscar was something that was sincere. It wasn't a fabrication. It wasn't just for the fun of it. He had this deep romantic streak within him. So when he loved with passion. So therefore, it was rather difficult for the Marquis to break this up, because Oscar would never let go. The Marquis even visited Wilde's home in Tite Street with a couple of his own heavies, and Wilde literally threw them out because they expected him to be this effete person, and Oscar was my size, 6'4", big, strong man. So he literally picked up Marquis's grooms and threw them out of his house, which I always think wonderful. So it all grew to a head when Oscar's Oscar's great triumph opened, and it was The Importance of Being Earnest. Oscar and Bosie had been away, and in fact, Bosie was still, I think it was in Algiers, when the play was about to open. And the Marquis, rumor had it, or the word had come out, that the Marquis was going to turn up at the opening night and insult Oscar by presenting him with a bouquet of rotting vegetables. This would create a scandal, a social outrage, and all of that, and help bring things to a head. However, the theatre and George Alexander, who ran the theatre, the Haymarket, discovered this, and so the Marquis's tickets were taken back, and a policeman was placed at the stage door. And when the Marquis turned up, he was not allowed to enter the theatre, so he stormed off in a rage. The play opened, tremendous success. But the Marquis sometime later went and delivered a note to Oscar's club, the Albemarle, and the note was left with the porter. And the note was possibly one of the most famous notes ever left at anybody's club. The handwriting was so bad, I think it's due to the anger of the Marquis. It took several attempts before anybody could decipher it. Originally, it was thought to say Oscar Wilde, Ponce and Sodomite. Later, it was deciphered as Oscar Wilde posing Sodomite. And finally, and at the very first trial, it was finally confirmed as reading Oscar Wilde posing as a Sodomite. Nobody seemed to, having worked out what all the wording was, nobody seemed to question the fact that the Marquis had completely misspelt the word sodomite. However, I mean, one composes a sodomite, there's nothing wrong with that. It's the being of the sodomite, which was the problem in late Victorian England. Now, Oscar received this note a few days later when he went into his club, and it was deeply shocking initially, because he was being accused of something that in society would have been considered absolutely an outrage. He was so upset, he wrote to Robbie, he wrote to, contacted Bosie and said, I don't see any way out of this, I'm going to have to sue him, to sue the Marquis. And then he was sort of talked down from that by various friends. But Bosie and his family really wanted Oscar to go for it. And they put pressure on him and even offered to put up money to help support a criminal case. So eventually Oscar was persuaded and agreed to go forward to prosecute Marquis of Queensbury, a prosecution for criminal libel. In other words, not a personal, not a private charge, not suing him privately, but a criminal charge that could have resulted in the Marquis going to prison. Why? Why would that be possible? It was just a card left in Oscar's club. Well, the fact that the card had been left in an open envelope at the desk of the porter, which meant that the porter could have seen the contents, technically meant that it had been published, as much as if he had written it in a newspaper. It was a published libel. Now, the charges were brought, and the Marquis was, shall we say, detained, and a trial was prepared. When you commit a libel, one of the things that you use to defend yourself and that is expected from you is what was called a plea of justification. In other words, if I've said to Oscar Wilde posing as a sodomite or a sodomite, I am allowed to say why I said it, and if it is considered legitimate and correct, then I have not committed a libel, I have told the truth. So the plea of justification required that the Marquis prove that Oscar was posing as a sodomite. He doesn't say you are, he says you are appearing to be. complex. But the Queensbury team then began to search for Oscar's fellow participants in his sexual activities, and they found several. And Oscar was staying a lot at the Savoy Hotel. His rooms were searched. The sheets from his beds were inspected. An awful lot of underground and unpleasant activity went on. But when it came to trial, they were able to present to the court the names of over a dozen boys solicited by Wilde to commit the act of sodomy. That was devastating enough. They also, but not, it wasn't absolute convinced proof, because a lot of these boys were what were known as rent boys, and their testimony could have been considered dubious. What really damaged Oscar was his own ego. At the trial, and remember, he was not the defendant at this trial. He was the prosecutor. It was the Marquis of Queensbury who was on trial. And the Marquis had employed a very, very brilliant up-and-coming lawyer called Carson. And Carson was a very old friend of Oscar from Dublin. Carson, by the way, was, if you know the story of the Winslow boy, or indeed the play or the movie, that lawyer was Carson. Brilliant mind, Dubliner, of course, therefore brilliant. But he had taken the case, I think he'd taken the case to make sure that whatever was done fair. And yet what he did in his cross-examination of Oscar was a devastating piece of destruction. And Oscar's own ego got in the way of everything. They used things that he had written, and there is the famous example of the sonnet. He had written a letter to Bosie, and I'm going to read it. He described it as a sonnet. He described it as a poem or a prose poem. Well, different occasionally as a prose poem, and sometimes as a sonnet. They're two different things. But anyway, the letter reads, "My own boy, your sonnet is quite lovely, and it is a marvel that those red rose-leaf lips of yours should have been no less for the music of song than for the madness of kisses. Your slim gilt soul walks between passion and poetry. I know that Hyacinthus, whom Apollo loved so madly, was you in Greek days." And then he goes on to say, when you come down to where you're going to be, come and see me, go and visit your mother. But those opening phrases were used as a demonstration that the relationship between Oscar and Lord Alfred Douglas was more than simply friendship. Carson really pushed on that. Carson wanted, in fact, he read it out in the court, actually, and because Oscar had described it as something beautiful, and Carson read it out, and Oscar said, and asked Oscar, "Is this beautiful?" To which Oscar replied, "Not the way you read it, Mr. Carson." But again, the ego was so strong, this sort of fundamental belief that he was right and that he was perfectly justified and that he had done nothing wrong and that he was an artist. That ego got in his way constantly. And I think the fact that Carson they'd known each other from Trinity, and even before that, apparently there's a story that they had known each other from childhood. Oscar said of him when he heard that Carson was going to be the defender for Queensbury, the quote was, "No doubt he will perform his task with the added bitterness of an old friend." Carson wasn't going to let him away with anything. He wanted things done fairly, but he was going to do his job with extreme care. By the end of that first trial, Carson literally had Oscar on the ropes. And there was the famous exchange, and I'm not going into too much detail, but there was a famous exchange about kissing. And they went through that list of boys that I mentioned. Did you like this boy? Did you buy this boy gifts? Were you fond of this boy? How much time did you spend with this boy? Did you kiss this boy? Certainly not. Did you kiss this boy? Certainly not. Did you kiss this boy? Certainly not. Until he hit one name. Did you kiss this boy? Oh, no, he was far too plain. And Carson had him. Oscar was completely thrown by the whole thing. His sense of composure broke down. The whole thing began to collapse, and in a very, very brief period of time, Oscar was totally on the rails. The Marquis won his case. The plea of justification was accepted. No libel had committed, which means that Oscar was posing as a sodomite. The justification had been proved, the libel not. And if you don't prove the libel, then what it says is legally true. Now, this meant that Oscar was immediately suspect for committing a criminal offense. They could not prove actual sodomy, but a new law quite recently had come into England and had been approved. It was now a law, and it was for cases where it was originally a law that was to help protect young girls on the streets, and that if illicit activity was committed, then the perpetrator could be prosecuted. It was an attempt to get girls off the streets, prostitutes. And then somebody said, well, we should include boys in that as well, because London was rife, and especially the West End, with rent boys, boys who would sell themselves in exactly the same way that young girls were selling themselves. So this new crime of gross indecency was created. And it wasn't for sodomy, it wasn't for rape, it was gross indecency. It was about molestation, basically, or physical activities that did not constitute the complete sexual act. And that's what Oscar was then charged with, because they couldn't prove anything more than that. But that in itself was a serious offense. And once the trial collapsed and the Marquis was proven to be correct in law, immediately Oscar should have been arrested. They didn't. They gave him the rest of the. He went out of the courtroom. He went to the Cadogan Hotel, the famous poem by John Betjeman about drinking hock and seltzer. The police waited for ages before they went to arrest him. His friends were imploring him, go to France, go to France, go to France. Now, get the train, get the boat, go to France. There he would have been safe from prosecution. He refused. Ironically, on that evening, as that particular night, more young gentlemen crossed from Dover to Dieppe or Calais than more crossed on that night than would normally go there in a month. An awful lot of young men were running out of London in terror that there was going to be a purge. So he sat in his room in the Cadogan Hotel with his glass of hock and seltzer, and police waited and waited till the last possible moment. Nobody wanted a trial. Nobody wanted him to go to court because it would be a public scandal. It would raise so many awkward questions about society. Nobody wanted him to do it, but he did. Why? He wanted them to arrest him. He wanted to stand trial. Why? And this is the great why about Oscar. Why did he do that? He could so easily have just left England, gone to France, lived there. He spoke fluent French. He had a huge fan base in Paris. He was very comfortable in Europe. Why did he stay? He wanted the trial. In fact, there were two trials. Two more trials. The first trial, in which all the evidence was presented, the jury couldn't agree. So a new trial was ordered, and the final trial, the third, began on, it was May 20th, 1895, at the Old Bailey, and the judge was a Mr. Justice Wills, I beg your pardon, and the jury, of course, consisted of 12 men. In this trial, all the evidence that had been created during the Queensbury trial was regurgitated, represented. The evidence of young boys. There were some of the young men were on trial with Oscar, so he wasn't on his own in the dock. There were others, and you can read all about that. But suddenly it had gone from being a celebrity court case to being something a lot more seedy, a lot more unpleasant, because Oscar was now associated with the kind of rent boys that normally, in normal society, no gentleman would ever meet, unless it was surreptitiously in the middle of the night with banknotes being passed from one to the other. But there was Oscar in the dock beside people that were prostitutes, young men who were prostitutes and procurers, one of them in particular. In the course of this trial, and again we come to Oscar's capacity for words, which never truly left him, ever. What they were trying to do was to ascertain or to demonstrate that the behavior, and when you look back in our enlightened days, when you look back now to the late Victorian period, when you're looking back 130 odd years to how homosexuality was considered, and in our enlightened day, and why Oscar, in a way, is still an iconic for the gay community. I think we come close to the answer of that question, why. In the course of that trial, a particular poem was produced that had been written by Bosie Douglas, not a great poem by any means. It had been published in a magazine, I think it was a university magazine called The Chameleon, and the poem was called The Two Loves. And in it, Bosie refers to one conventional love, the normal, what we would consider the appropriate love between a man and a woman. But then he refers to the other love. And the other love describes himself as the love that dare not speak its name. You may have probably heard that phrase, but it was from this particular poem, not by Oscar, but by Bosie Douglas. Oscar was asked by the prosecuting counsel, what is the love that dare not speak its name? Now, you might think, well, that's a pretty obvious question. Not then. There were an awful lot of people of high rank and broad education who didn't understand these things. It occurred after Oscar's death. There was a trial, a prosecution of a woman who used to give performances dancing the role of Salome. And the trial was based on what was described, if you'll pardon my saying so, as the cult of the clitoris. Now, one of the judge on the case was actually overheard in his club asking, who is this clitoris person? And that demonstrates the degree of ignorance about matters sexual in the late Victorian period. It was not discussed. It was something you never went near. No hope for those who practice anything that would be considered immoral, because everything was immoral in the Victorian mind. So when the lawyer asked, what is the love that dare not speak his name, I think it is reasonable to suppose that he knew, but the majority of people weren't sure, especially the jury. And so Oscar replied. And here perhaps we get a glimpse of why he did not flee to France. I think Oscar at the time felt an overwhelming, a tsunami of emotions. But he also felt, I think, a sense of his own martyrdom. And he was a martyr to a particular cause, and that cause was himself. His belief in his sort of philosophy about his own sense of love, his own sense of adoration, his own sense of passion. And it was homosexual, but to him it was no lesser than any heterosexual relationship. And he did something that was, I think, a little naughty, quite brilliant. He described it, the love that dare not speak its name, so beautifully. And let us also note, he didn't know the question was coming. So what he said was completely off the cuff. And I wish to God I had this degree of the use of the English language and the capacity to compose literally on your feet while standing in a dock. I'm going to read some of it. The love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is in this century misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name. And on account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man, when the elder man has intellect and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks at it, and sometimes puts one in a pillory for it. Made that up as he went along, and a most eloquent response. Somewhat economical with the truth, let it be said. Platonic love, in its pure sense, is not physical. And Oscar's relationships most certainly were. But that said, I think that within that speech, you see Oscar's fundamental philosophy that love is above the physical. If it is real love, it goes beyond the physical. It is it's something intellectual, something spiritual, something that involves the passion of the soul. And who would deny that in any relationship? When one declares love for somebody, isn't that what it's meant to be about? And not simply the fact that you go to bed together. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. And though they couldn't technically prove sodomy, they did prove gross indecency, that he behaved inappropriately with young men. Justice Wills, who was really the archetypal Victorian judge, was venomous. He said, "It is no use for me to address you. People who can do such things must be dead to all sense of shame. I shall be expected to pass the severest sentence that the law allows. In my judgment, it is totally inadequate for such a case as this. The sentence of this court is that you be imprisoned and kept to hard labor for 2 years." Doesn't sound too bad, does it? Hard labor in a Victorian prison was cruelty beyond imagining. And especially to somebody like Oscar, who, to be fair, tough, big, heavy man, but that kind of physical labor would break the strongest of men. And so, Reading jail for 2 years, hard labor. In that time, he suffered. Physically, he was set to picking oakum. Oakum was the old ropes from sailing ships that was covered with tar, and they had to pull them apart by hand, and what was left was used for the padding that would be put between the planks of new ships. It literally tore the skin from the bones. There was a thing, you might have heard the term, and it's certainly in European, or certainly in British prison system, the term a prison guard is called a screw. And it comes from the fact that if a prisoner couldn't leave his cell, then they had a screw with a handle on it inside the cell that they had to turn. And this was connected by a ratchet to something outside. And if the prisoner wasn't working hard enough, they could tighten the screw and make it harder to turn. And they were working. There was also the treadmill. All of these things were part of hard labor in a prison, and they were cruel, they were torture, they were agonizing, and he had that for 2 years. After he left prison, because Oscar's wit always remained with him, he had that one. When you stay in prison in the United Kingdom, you are in prison in Her Majesty's prison, or His Majesty, depending on who's on the throne. At the time, it was Victoria, so it was Her Majesty's prison. You are a prisoner of Her Majesty. And the line he came out with was, if this is the way Her Majesty treats her prisoners, she doesn't deserve to have any. He could always find something to amuse. But being in that prison, I think, broke his spirit. I think it was a sense of a divine punishment. Because while he was there, amongst other things, he did manage to write a letter. Doesn't sound too impressive. But this letter was written to Bosie, and it was an explanation. He wanted Bosie to understand a truth about their relationship. And that wasn't easy because, A, you weren't allowed to write. He happened to have a very enlightened, for Victorian times, prison governor who allowed him this. But the allowance was that he could have one sheet of blue prison paper per day, and he could write in pencil. And at the end of the day, that piece of paper had to be given back, and the next morning, another piece of paper would be given to him. So he had no back reference. And when you look at it, it's amazing for how few changes or errors are on it. And his memory must have been so absolute that he knew exactly what he'd written before. You try to write what is basically a book of one single letter and maintain that stream of consciousness so accurately, one sheet of paper at a time, one day at a time. This is Oscar's intellect. Now this et vinculus in carcere, the truth in prison, eventually was given a different name, not by Oscar, but by Robbie Ross. He called it De Profundis, which was the title of I think it's Psalm 130, 104, I can't remember which, out of the depths, O Lord, because it was out of the depths of his despair that Oscar wrote this letter. And I think if there was one piece of writing of Oscar's, if everything else were ever destroyed completely and utterly, I would save De Profundis. Because it is a personal confession from somebody who not only confesses his own weakness, but admonishes somebody he loves and explains to a large extent his own philosophy, his own fundamental beliefs in humanity, and finds his way, in a strange way, to the God he was never quite sure he believed in. Oscar always had a deep sense of religion, but not necessarily of any particular faith. He was brought up as a Protestant, as a member of the Church of Ireland or the Episcopalian community. He had an utter fascination with the Greeks, with Greek philosophy, with Greek writing, with Greek poetry, and with Greek religion, that notion of the Greek gods, this wonderful family of gods that represented just about every human frailty. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the Greek gods is that they are so human. They're like a very, very dysfunctional family. And I think Oscar had a particular passion for that, loved it in its concept. But he also was deeply attracted to the Catholic Church, and possibly because of its ritual, because ritual impressed him. The whole notion that religion could be an act, a physical, beautiful, sensual, almost erotic act. and I don't mean erotic in the corrupt sense, but it gave a kind of physical as well as emotional and spiritual satisfaction. So he was always attractive. There are accounts that, and I do believe it, that late in life he did go over to and was baptized or received into the Catholic Church. But again, it was I think, much more to do with its rituals and the paraphernalia of following Catholicism than anything much deeper than that. Because whether he actually believed in a God, I'm not absolutely certain. But anyway, he started this letter. Now, it began as a kind of, it was a letter to Bosie, and it was a letter to explain how hurt he was and how upset he was. Now, if you recall, I talked about a letter he sent to Florence Balcom, Florrie, after he discovered that she had gone off with Bram Stoker, in which he gently mentioned the cross he had bought her, and would he give it back because she couldn't wear it since their names were entwined, and also because it would mean so little to her, but it would mean so much to him. And in a way, De Profundis was a vast expansion on that concept of, I know you don't love me, I will always love you, let me tell you about that. The important point is that at the beginning of De Profundis, he takes the blame himself for everything that happened. And I'm not going to get too complex about this. I just beseech you, get a copy of De Profundis and read it. It is remarkable. It is a volume. It is a novella-length prose poem. And there are some extraordinary pieces in it. He begins by taking the blame. He begins the letter, I will begin by telling you, I blame myself terribly. As I sit here in this dark cell, in convict's clothes, a disgraced and ruined man, I blame myself. From the very first, there was too wide a gap between us. And from that point on, it becomes a summation of his philosophy and of his life to that point. And this notion that there was too wide a gap, and there was, not simply age. Age is, I say this as an old man, age is not important. And there are many relationships throughout history where the older and the younger work together perfectly well. And his philosophical attachment to the Platonic relationship of the older, wiser man and the younger, excited, eager young man, that can work as a relationship. Not forever. There comes a point when you get too old. But it can work, and it did work. But it was terribly one-sided. And Oscar, contemplating it from a prison cell, began to realize just how one-sided that relationship was. That there's a sequence in it when he talks about the fact that a single typical day in his relationship with Bosie would be that he would try to write, but Bosie would turn up mid-morning and want to talk and smoke cigarettes, and then they'd insist on having lunch, and that would include drinking. Then in the afternoon, he would go away for a while, return at tea time when he would expect more conversation, more tea. Then he would go and dress for dinner. Then he would insist Oscar take them out for dinner to some restaurant, and then they would have to go back to the club and spend the evening drinking champagne and brandy. And that Oscar, and he finishes that sequence by saying, I would go and have a very simple meal in a very simple restaurant with Robbie Ross, and the conversation would end up producing a wonderful piece of writing. But in the time that he was together with Bosie, he never wrote one single word. Bosie occupied him completely. He had to literally escape from Bosie, to go down the country, to go to Brighton, to go to Bournemouth, to other places, so that he could find the time to write, because Bosie occupied him. It was triumph of the younger over the elder, of the young and foolish over the wise, and he should have had the wisdom to understand that. But he's only becoming to terms with that. In other words, in De Profundis, it is Oscar looking back over his life and realizing what he did wrong. What he did wrong was not what they put in prison for. What he did wrong was to misunderstand the human nature in a young man who was basically destroyed him. So he actually, the letter, De Profundis, is almost a summation of, or a completion of a thought that he had while still on trial. And he, in De Profundis, he writes this. I think I've read this piece before. I remember as I was sitting in the dock on the occasion of my last trial, listening to Lockwood's appalling denunciation of me, that was the prosecuting lawyer, like one of Savonarola's indictments of the popes at Rome. Suddenly it occurred to me how splendid it would be if I were saying all this about myself. I saw then at once that what is said of a man is nothing. The point is, who says it? A man's very highest moment is, I have no doubt at all, when he kneels in the dust and beats his breast and tells all the sins of his life. It is the ultimate mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. It is that act of confession that purifies. So in a sense, what Oscar, I think, with De Profundis was attempting was a kind of self-purification, because he began to realize things. You could imagine De Profundis as a magnificent piece of self-denunciation. It's deeply sincere. It is deeply self-pitying as well. But he begins to realize all the great truths. Even there's a section in it known as the Christ section, when he talks about Christ the poet, that only a poet who was a carpenter from Nazareth on the Sea of Galilee, with no background, no experience, no knowledge, could take upon himself, say, I will take the sins of the world upon myself, and do it. And that was the act of a poet. Christ as poet, a most beautiful chapter, beautiful section. And it is a fundamental religious philosophy worked out from his own subjugation by the law. This way of suddenly looking and saying, well, what do I believe? What am I a believer in? What is this? What is the effect of this religious doctrine on me? I am a poet. I am suffering. He, in a way, places himself in the Christ-like position as martyr, but he is examining it. He is questioning it all the way through. As I say, it's deeply sincere and self-pitying at the same time. He talks, he would love to have a religion for the non-believer, where you drink unsanctified wine and eat unsanctified bread, because everybody needs a ritual. Whether you believe or not, we need ritual. It's part and parcel of what makes us human. So he's all the way through this, examining, discussing with himself, with Bosie that he is writing to, what he now understands. And as I say, one page at a time, collected each evening, working from memory of what he'd written before, and the whole thing not given back to him until his release. Actually, when he was released, and it was given back to him, Oscar gave it to Robbie Ross, and he wanted Robbie to give it to Bosie, because it was written to him. And Robbie very wisely thought that Bosie might destroy it. So he had 2 copies typed, and he gave one of the typed copies to Bosie. The original manuscript, by the way, is in the British Museum Library. So he sent one copy, the typed copies, to Bosie, and Bosie immediately destroyed it, as Robbie suspected he would. He kept the other typed copy. Why else is it important? Because it was a demonstration of Oscar's hopes and dreams, of what he saw himself as being and what he unfortunately became, what he wanted life to offer him and what life did give him. Another section from it. I wanted to eat of all the fruit of all the trees in the garden of the world. I was going out into the world with that passion in my soul, and so indeed I went out, and so I lived. My only mistake was that I confined myself to the sun-gilt side of the garden, and shunned the other side for its shadow and its gloom. Failure, disgrace, poverty, despair, suffering, tears even. The broken words that come from the lips of pain, remorse that makes one walk in thorns, conscience that condemns, the misery that puts ashes on its head and into its own drink puts gall. All these were things of which I was afraid. And as I had determined to do nothing of them, I was forced to taste each one of them in turn, to feed on them, to have for a season indeed no such other food at all. A terrible realization that everything that you strive for, everything that you believe in yourself, that wonderful discovery of all the things you are capable of spiritually, emotionally, artistically, all of it is going to be destroyed. He goes on, I don't regret for a single moment having lived for pleasure. There was no pleasure I did not experience. I love this. I threw the pearl of my life into a cup of wine. I went down the primrose path to the sound of flutes. I lived on honeycomb, but I had to pass on. The other half of the garden had its secrets for me also. That sudden, appalling realization that nothing is what you plan it to be. It's the old joke of how do you make God laugh? Tell him your plans. Eventually, reality took over in his life. A wonderful quote, all trials are trials for one's life. Any trial that you are put to, be it in a court of law, be it a testing, be it nature, being it life, being it your neighbors, being it your friends, all trials that you are put to are a trial for your life, because your life is what you build. Your life is what you're capable of. Your life is what you understand it to be. We all have plans. Everybody has plans. Nobody expects to be where they end up. I never, for instance, for myself, I trained in London back in the 60s. I thought I was going to be the next Laurence Olivier, and all sorts of wonderful things would happen. I spent most of my life in the Irish theatre, working in a particular theatre. I was terribly lucky, working for the Gate. So I never in a million years expected that I would be here in Pittsburgh, running a theatre company and talking to you on the internet. These things happen. Life happens. Life sometimes happens the way you would like it, but more often than not, life will always surprise and amaze you. All trials are trials for one's life. It goes on. Society will have no place for me. And there he was right. He was wonderful at predicting his own future. But nature will have clefts in the rock where I may hide, and secret valleys in whose silence I may weep undisturbed. That romantic thing was always there, never left him. He will always find that romantic description of how he would suffer. But then it concludes the whole piece with the most amazing and generous advice for this young man that he loved to the point of self-destruction. With a piece of philosophy that may not have been originally his, but he just puts it so succinctly and so perfectly. Do not be afraid of the past. The past, the present, and the future are but one moment in the sight of God. Whatever lies before me is my past. Now, whether you are religious or not, whether you believe in God or not, the sentiment remains true. Whatever lies before me is my past. Because, and it's a phrase I use with young actors all the time, when discussing what the nature of acting is and how one does the process of self-examination, you are the sum total of your own experience. What you are now and what you will do next are the sum total of your own experience. Or as he puts it, what is before me is my past. He goes on, I've got to make myself look on that with different eyes. I've got to make the world look on that with different eyes, to make God look on it with different eyes. In other words, that I have learned and developed from my own experience, and that I have been judged and I have been punished, and now I must make the world look at me differently. I must present myself as my true self, not simply what I've been punished for. I must be me. And I've got to get the world to see me in that sense. He was released from prison on May 19th, 1897, 2 years. He served every single day of his 2-year servitude. Bosie was not there to greet him when he left the prison. But who was there? Robbie Ross, his most faithful friend. Robbie was always there. So Wilde now went into voluntary exile. Terrible things had happened. His mother had died. His wife had changed her name. She became, from Constance Wilde, she took the name of a cousin and became, because if she'd gone to being Constance Lloyd again, everybody would know who she was. So she took the name Holland and changed her sons' names as well, so that Cyril and Vivian Holland. They lived in France and northern Italy. The boys went to school to the Jesuit school in Monaco, in Monte Carlo. She would not let him see the boys. She would see him if he promised not to have anything to do with Bosie. She gave him a small allowance out of her own income because he had nothing. Everything he owned had been sold. He had been declared bankrupt to cover the costs of the Marquis of Queensbury's expenses. Everything he owned sold, including the copyrights on his own work. He was literally a beggar. Eventually, Constance gave up on him because he could not resist going back to Bosie, to meeting with Bosie, spending time with Bosie, and living occasionally with Bosie. He had gone basically into a voluntary exile in Europe. I mean, he could have lived in England, but it would have been impossible. So he, on the north coast of France, he took rooms in a hotel in Berneval, and well, like this, he sort of he admitted he settled into a kind of profound laziness. The quote: "I enjoy outdoor sports. I have often played dominoes outside French cafes." As I say, the wit, quite amazingly, even though the melancholy eventually dominated, the wit never left him. He took an assumed name, Sebastian Melmoth, and Sebastian from his favorite saint, the great martyr, and Melmoth from there was a book written called Melmoth the Wanderer by a distant relative of his, who and his notion was that he had become the wanderer. So Sebastian Melmoth was his name in exile. There's a wonderful story about the Sebastian Melmoth. If we have time, I'll talk about it in a second. He began really to define isolation in a remarkable way, and also to finally stand up and say, "I am what I am." We all know the song. He put it wonderfully. "One's past is what one is. It is the only way one should be judged. A patriot put in prison for loving his country loves his country. A poet in prison for loving boys loves boys. We are what we are. I am what I am." This is what he's saying. "People thought it dreadful of me to have entertained at dinner the evil things of my life and to have found pleasure in their company. It was like feasting with panthers." To him, that romantic, the excitement of the thrill of being alive, living dangerously, if you like, breaking the law, certainly. But for him, it was that expression of romance that was what he defined himself as. Poverty completely overwhelmed him. It was something he had no true experience of. Remember, he came from a wealthy family, from a wealthy background. He had made vast sums of money. He was, if you like, in terms of theatre in London at the time of when he was writing and was a success, he was the Neil Simon of London theatre. He made more money on those plays and they all got spent on others, particularly Bosie. But now, I mean, he writes, I have no money at all. I live, or I am supposed to live, on a few francs a day. I love this. Like dear St. Francis of Assisi, I am wedded to poverty. But in my case, the marriage is not a success. He had the occasional reconciliation with Bosie, very little success. Once Oscar was without money, he would be without Bosie. Bosie was only there when there was money to spend. He was ignored by all but a few of his most faithful friends, such as Robbie and a couple of others. Finally, completely deserted by Bosie. No longer able to see his sons. And there is a beautiful story about that. When in Paris, and this is a story that was written, when his son Vivian wrote his first book, Son of Oscar Wilde, for the second edition, he put this story into the preface because he'd received a letter from a man called Lucien. And he told the story when he was young. His mother used to take him up to Paris. They lived outside Paris, and they would always go to this particular cafe. And one day they were sitting there, and he was running up and down, and he knocked over a salt cellar on the table of a gentleman. And the mother, he said, my mother scolded me, and the gentleman said, no, you mustn't scold him. No, it's fine. You must forgive him, and you must love him, and you must never scold him. And he said, the gentleman took my face in his hands and kissed me on each cheek. And I said, do you have a little boy? And he said, I have two, but I can no longer see them. And then that was it, and they went off. And the next time they came up, the gentleman wasn't there. So my mother asked the patron of the cafe, the gentleman, he was always here. Where is he? That is Monsieur Melmoth, an English writer, apparently. He is not here anymore, and had gone. But the Lucien had written to Vivian saying, I do believe those two kisses were for you and your brother, and I now return them to you. Beautiful story, absolutely true. That sense of isolation and loneliness was devastating. He had moved into a hotel, the Hotel d'Alsace in Paris, where on first sight he hated the wallpaper. And at that point, the famous quote came, which is apparently completely true. One of us has to go. The wallpaper survived him. That is where he died. He would sing for his supper in cafes. People would buy him his great weakness of absinthe, and he would sit and have conversation and be witty and charming, but he had no money, and he was drowning his pain and eventually killing himself with the absinthe. He died November 1900, totally worn out, and he even, in a strange way, prophesied his own death. In The Importance of Being Earnest, Algy talks about Bunbury, who died in Paris. And Lady Bracknell says, what did he die of? Oh, he was quite exploded. When Oscar died, he died of a septicemia, his body filled with pus. And when he died, every orifice gushed pus. It was disgusting. And his friends had to clean up the whole thing. It was appalling. Not only that, but his body had swollen so much that he could not even have left the room, because to get to the door of the room was a tiny corridor that he couldn't have got through. His death was appalling. But it was almost, I think, a culmination of the course or the journey of the martyr that he'd set himself on when sitting in the Cadogan Hotel with that glass of hock and seltzer saying, I will let them arrest me. He chose that route. I think it became more appalling than he ever could have dreamed of. But it was a choice he made. It wasn't accidental. He wrote, I've done recitals of Oscar for a long time. And one of the things I always finish with, and I'm just going to do the final phrase of it, because I think it is the perfect demonstration of the cynicism that eventually took over from the wit. And he's talking about the doer of good, who is clearly Jesus, going and seeing various people and realizing that the gift that he gave them has been turned into something that he did not expect, something corrupt. The blind man now follows women, because what else would you look at? And the woman who was in sin now wants to be followed because he forgave her sins. The guy who was a leper now has wonderful lavish parties and lots of people gathering around. And eventually he sees a young man on the roadside who was weeping. And he went towards him and touched the long locks of his hair and said to him, "Why are you weeping?" The young man looked up and recognized him and made answer, "I was dead once, and you raised me from the dead. What else should I do but weep?" I think at the end, that's where Oscar sees himself, not merely as the doer of good, but as the one to whom too much good has been done, and he is paying for it with his entire life. So there you are. I'm going to give you online a list of books to read. Now, the list, as I said, there will be more books written about Oscar Wilde than imaginable, but there are things I think that are really interesting, and you can never, ever, I don't think you'll ever get bored with the life of Oscar Wilde. So that will be going online, a new reading list. But the one thing I really do encourage you to try to get a copy of, well, you can get a copy of it, it's relatively easy, is De Profundis, the most beautiful, beautiful thing. Let's have a look. I have a couple of questions. In the last lecture, you mentioned Oscar was just disgusted by sodomy. How did that affect his actions response to the trial? It's when it's disgusted is possibly the wrong word. He was not into sodomy. He was not into anal sex. He was into oral sex and placing parts of your paraphernalia in other available parts of the human body. We don't need to go into it now. We'll only upset people. But he also liked to watch. Simple thing. He liked to watch. If you look at the movie that has Stephen Fry as Oscar, there's a scene in that where he's just simply watching. So I don't think it affected, in that sense, his response to the trial. Because he was not suing the Marquis because he said that he was a sodomite. He said he was posing as a sodomite. In other words, he was carrying out behavior that a sodomite might commit. They could not prove sodomy. They could not prove that he had physically. I mean, when I say they checked the sheets in the Savoy Hotel bedroom, what they were looking for were traces of semen. They could not absolutely prove it. And that's why they brought in the lesser, but still pretty savage charge of gross indecency. The legal definition between sodomy in Victorian England, difference between buggery and sodomy. A sodomite was somebody who carried out some buggery with a guy. It was a man-on-man situation. Buggery could be carried on between a man and a woman, but if it was a man and a man, it was sodomy. As far as I remember. It's been a long time since I looked up that definition. Good question. And if I'm wrong, you'll let me know. Did Wilde's early death lead to him becoming more famous? Did it add to his legend? That's a very interesting question. And the answer is yes and no. And that's why I would advise you to read various other things. and I'll put these up there on the thing. Read Robbie Ross's story, the Robbie Ross, Oscar Wilde's devoted friend. Read about Maud Allen and Salome's Last Dance, and the famous trial of her. There's an awful lot of accounts. Remember that after Oscar's trial, society changed radically. Suddenly, it was very risque to be effete. Men started cutting their hair a lot quicker. It wasn't just the First World War and lice. You just did not want to be associated with the effete. He literally went underground in that sense, and the whole of what one might call the whole gay London went underground, where people were a little risque in their activities. It stayed way underground and right through to the 1950s and 60s. And it was only when it was decriminalized, and I'm trying to remember when it was, I think it was the 60s. So that whole period of time, homosexuality became absolutely huge risk in terms of prosecution. And that's why somebody like Noel Coward never ever in his entire life admitted to his homosexuality. Members of the royal family, well-known celebrities, nobody admitted to it, because you would be A, you would be castigated, B, you could risk criminal prosecution. The other book to read, and if you can find it online, is the film of it with John Hurt, is The Naked Civil Servant, which is the story of Quentin Crisp, who is one of the inheritors of all of this. But Oscar, yes, I think Oscar's death was a kind of martyrdom, and it did to an extent make him more famous. And of course, Robbie's dedication of the grave in Paris and getting the Epstein's grave goods also helped to a degree. Is there a parallel between Basil speaking of his adoration to Dorian in the book and Oscar's speech during the trial? Yes, absolutely. Oscar, I think I said it before, Oscar never wasted a good line by only saying it 3 times. Oscar had these phrases in his head. I think Oscar never stopped writing, even in his sleep. He was composing and constructing the right phrases, the right way to say things. W.B. Yeats, when he was a young man, was invited, because he was a young Irish poet, invited to Oscar's house in Tite Street. I told you what I think about commenting about the fact that the room, everything was white. Everything was white. But he also said that Oscar Wilde was the only person he ever met who spoke in perfectly constructed sentences. That is not easy, but Oscar did it. And just as he could have conversations in ancient Greek about the weather, he could, as he spoke, was composing sentences perfectly. So yes, I absolutely agree with that. He would use, everything he said was from him, about him. He was the sum total of his own art. So yeah. Yes. Does Oscar equate God and nature during the section where he writes, nature whose sweet rains fall on the just and unjust alike? Or is nature a romantic element? No, I think that in that sense, there is a pantheistic truth to Oscar as well. Just in the same way that, for instance, Wordsworth, Lines Above Tintern Abbey. I think that for him, for Oscar, I would go so far as to say that everything was God. And that when he talks about the Greek gods, it's a bit like, you listen to any Hindu guru who will tell you, no, we have 100 gods, but each one represents an aspect of God. That I think for Oscar, that was also true. I don't think that he was a guru in that sense, and I certainly wouldn't have gone to him for religious instruction. But I think you will find that there is a fascination in the way he viewed how the world worked, how nature worked, how we were a part of it. He was pantheistic in that sense, and deeply Catholic in his love of the ritual, the odor of sanctity, the incense. And to finish that answer to that question, yes, he is always romanticizing his own suffering, because the Oscar, who is the poet, cannot resist romanticizing everything around him and everything that he feels. So the answer to that question is yes, yes, and yes. Nature is God, and nature is a romantic element, and nature is a romanticization of his own suffering, yes. What are my thoughts on the Ballad of Reading Gaol? Oh my goodness me, I could do a whole program on that. Reading Gaol is exactly what it says on the title. It is a ballad. It is an Irish ballad. It is from an Irish person. And Oscar, from his childhood, had listened to laments and ballads and even the rhythm of the thing. It is a ballad rhythm. It is a beautiful construct and description of the futility of punishment, because we punish people for doing that which they are incapable of not doing. Each man kills the thing he loves. And so as a piece of writing, I mean, there are sections in it that I think possibly overwritten, but I would think that about Shakespeare too. But yes, it's another one of those things that you ought to read. But when you read Ballad of Reading Gaol, read it aloud and let the rhythm get into you. Let the rhythm get into the words, because rather like Shakespeare, it reads better when you listen to it. It is written to be heard as much as it is to be read. I think it's magnificent. I think some of the descriptions in it, there is no chapel on the day on which they hang a man. The fact, they won't put a marker on his grave. That they won't give him the symbol of Christ because he is a sinner. Christ came to save sinners. I mean, all the absurdities of the Victorian punishment system, of any country's punishment system. So yeah, my thoughts on the Battle of Reading Gaol. Go and read it if you haven't, and tell me what you think about it, because you can always email me and give your opinion. Who was with Oscar on his deathbed? You'd immediately ask me, and because I'm getting old, I can never remember names. Reggie Turner was one of them, and there was another one, and her name's gone out of me. Robbie wasn't there because he was off trying to get money for Oscar. I think he actually had gone back to London, but came as soon as the word came that Oscar had died. Interestingly enough, he owed his hotel bill, and the owner of the hotel actually paid the bill to himself. Actually gave the money on behalf of Oscar. He admired him so much. So we've got any other questions? Just have a quick check. How much publicity was there about Oscar during and after his trial? I think the trial itself raised an awful lot of publicity. It was a great cause célèbre. Once he had been sentenced and put away in prison, I think society wanted to forget about it as quickly as possible. When the Ballad of Reading Gaol was published, his name wasn't on. It was by C33, which was the number of his cell in Reading Gaol. Lady Windermere's, can't remember which play it was. I think it might have been Ernest, was still running. And the posters for the playbills took off his name, and it was just simply by the author of Lady Windermere's Fan. His name was sort of a bit like the ancient Egyptians did. Every time there was a new pharaoh, they took the name of the previous one off. They got rid of his name as quickly as could, because it was anathema. He was scandalous. Did the trial and suffering bring forward a more humble side to Wilde? Is there any humility in that martyrdom of taking the blame and responsibility for his downfall? That, Grace, is a very good question. And the answer is both. Yes, there are no simple answers to these things. I think there was a degree of humility in the writing of De Profundis. I think he was, to an extent, trying to take the blame while at the same time telling Bosie that he had done a terrible thing. And I mean, as I say, I could do a whole series of programs just on De Profundis itself, but which I'm not going to do. But he, yes, I think he did feel humbled, but he was incapable of being humble. I think that's the complexity of that. That he felt humbled by what had happened, but his need to recognize himself as a victim and as a martyr gave him a kind of self-aggrandizement at the same time. It's not an easy question to answer. Is there a performance on YouTube of Salome? Yes, there is one, which is the Stephen Berkoff performance. When we did it first back in 1988, Stephen Berkoff directed it and I played Herod. Stephen then went on to play it himself, and I continued to play it. So we had two separate productions. I did a lot of choreographing of the original with his blessing. He played a very different kind of Herod to the way I did it, but his got videoed because it was at the National Theatre, and it is available. I have seen it on VHS. I don't know whether it's on DVD, but you can probably find it online. Check YouTube would be my answer. He's a very good Herod. However, actually, I'm gonna have a little moment of Wildean self-aggrandizement. There was a review, and I think it was in Country Life magazine by Michael Billington, and it was a long assessment after Stephen had done it in the National Theatre in London, saying this and that and this and that and that, comparing it to the original production which he'd seen in Dublin with myself. And one of the nicest reviews I ever got was a review of Stephen Berkoff's production, in which they said that Billington said at the end of it, at the end of the day, it must be acknowledged that Stephen Berkoff acts Herod to the hilt. Unfortunately for him, Alan Stanford has already portrayed it to the life. Yes. Sorry, little gloat there. One more. Let me look at one more. Yes, he does. And yeah, in De Profundis, he writes a great deal about the abject humiliation of trial. And I think that's the point, that when he says all trials are trials for one's life, when you are on trial, and whether you be on trial in the highest court in the land, or whether you're up in front of a magistrate or a district judge or whatever, you are exposed. You are exposed in a way over which you have no control. I mean, you look at trials on television or whatever. The accused is exactly that. Your identity even has gone. You are the accused. You have become an object for examination, for cross-examination, and for condemnation, unless they have not proved you guilty and you were exonerated. But for the rest of your life in there, you know that you were put on trial, and everybody else knows, well, I wonder if they did do it. You never know. There is something about a trial that is, in its very essence, damaging. It damages you whether you are innocent or guilty, whether it was a tiny little offense or whether it was, the murder of millions. All trials are trials for one's life. I think it was a great truism. And I think that's all we've got time for. I'm going to do the housekeeping notes yet again. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about Oscar Wilde. As you may have gathered, Oscar is a particular passion of mine. I have a great love of his writing, and I'm blessed with the fact that his grandson is a friend of mine, and that's been a tremendous aid in the kind of learning curve that I've had with regard to Oscar's writing. Our outreach, as I said at the beginning, has become huge. Please spread the word. Please tell your friends. We will be here again next week. Please fill in the poll at the bottom to answer our questions about the time that we broadcast. Please email us. Let us know what you think. We do try to reply to every question that we get. So if you email in a question or you have a question on that list at the bottom of the page, we'll do the best we can to answer that as quickly as possible. If it doesn't happen instantly, just remember I'm still trying to run a theatre company on the phone. So we'll get to you as quickly as we can, and I promise it will be within the week. You can email us, www.picttheatre.org. You can use that methodology to send us a donation. And as I say, every dollar counts, every euro counts. Anything you can send us, the banking system will convert it into dollars for us. Please, please, please do consider. We want you to support the arts. We especially want you to support theatre, because theatre is going to be under tremendous strain and have a lot of problems for at least the next 12 months. But if you can support PICT, and if you want to support PICT, and if you want to support our endeavor, we're going to keep bringing you material. We'll be doing the webinars every week. We're going to start presenting also some theatre, some poetry, some plays. We're going to do a little bit of radio drama as well. All of this will begin to fold out over the summer. I'll tell you more about that next week. Next week, we are doing the first of 2 programs about the play Salome. Do give it a read if you can. And again, it's another one of those plays, and I suggest to you, read it aloud to yourself, because the music of the words is quite amazing, and I'll be talking about that. One final thing, as I say, the trivia last week, won by Patricia Passeltainer, and the answer was Francesca Jane Elgie. This week, the question, you have to go researching for this one now. I bet you won't know this off the top of your heads. When Oscar was sentenced at the end of the 3rd trial, and before he was transferred to Reading Jail, where he served his 2-year sentence, which particular prison was he sent to? The first prison he was sent to after the trial, when he was convicted. He sent him to another prison before they transferred him to Reading Jail. What was that prison? That's your question. Apart from that, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. As every week, I am so delighted that you want to spend this time with us, and we love spending the time with you. Thank you all. Have a great week. In spite of the easing of restrictions, take care. I want you all back next week.